Today's lecture is about whether or not the benefits of First Amendment protection of anonymous speech outweigh the harms. This is the public forum debate topic for the National Speech and Debate Association's National Tournament in June. In today's lecture, I'm going to review the background of the resolution and identify the basic dispute. We'll also look at the status quo and the relevant Supreme Court cases. In this introductory part, we also look at the limits to protection in a review of the terms of the resolution. Let's start with a few of the basics. First, it is very important to point out that this is an old controversy, but also a very new issue. It is really a controversy that dates all the way back to the founding of the United States, where we saw that many of our forefathers were engaging in anonymous publication of their speech, whether it be through the form of pamphlets or short memos or just kind of general directives and issue papers. It's become a very prominent issue recently because we see applications such as Yik Yak and other places on the internet where people are posting anonymously, often in very negative ways that kind of express hate speech or misogyny to hate towards women, and can even be threatening. And because of this, we see a lot of kind of a new debate about the value of anonymous speech. Generally, the resolution pits free and comfortable expression versus the harm. The reason you arguably want to have anonymous speech is so people feel free expressing themselves without kind of people coming back and say, why did you say this? Why did you say that? Penalizing them socially or on their job. And then you compare that to kind of the harms that result from the anonymous speech, such as the harassment, the hate speech, the speech directed against women. It does intrinsically kind of involve the expression of hate speech. There's a separate debate, a separate body of literature really about the value of hate speech and hate expression. But since protecting anonymous speech really inherently involves protecting this type of expression, it's very much a core component of the debate. Now, what's going on in the status quo? How does the status quo deal with hate speech? First, it's important to note that anonymous speech. First, it's important to point out that anonymous speech has generally been protected by the courts under the First Amendment. And this piece of evidence from Wiki Law talks about the First Amendment to right to speak anonymously in diverse contexts. It notes it arises from a long-standing tradition of American advocates of speaking through pseudonyms such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who authored the Federalist Papers. The Supreme Court has stated that an author's decision to remain anonymous is an aspect of the freedom of speech protected by the First Amendment. This is because the interest in having anonymous works enter the marketplace of ideas unquestionably outweighs any public interest in requiring exposure as a condition of entry. So what the Supreme Court has generally said this is acceptable. And they've done so in a couple critical cases. The first case is McIntyre versus Ohio, which dates back to 1995, in which a woman was expressing in a local school board election, was expressing her opinion anonymously. And the Ohio Elections Commission challenged that and said she should not be able to do that. But the Supreme Court did rule in her favor and argue that she should be able to express herself in a political sense in this way anonymously, so it protected political speech. In Reno versus the ACLU, they extended that and they said that it also protects anonymous speech that is not political. So we kind of generally see the Supreme Court acting and saying that anonymous speech is protected by the First Amendment. Now, it is important to note out, although the Supreme Court says it's generally protective, there are limits. In other words, the First Amendment protection of free speech, First Amendment protection of anonymous free speech is not unlimited. You can't say or do anything you want, and no one can find out about you. For example, if you libel someone, if you say something about someone, that's false, that can hurt their image, that is not true, there are ways to kind of find out. The courts have said, not just the Supreme Court, but other courts, other federal courts and state courts who have been interpreting what the Supreme Court has said in its other decisions and in other kind of relevant First Amendment laws is you can't just kind of generally libel someone. You can't make threats, particularly threats that are imminent or that are genuine. There was actually a recent Supreme Court case, very recent, about whether or not you can have threatening speech on the internet, which is a previous UILLD topic, and they said you can make threats, but it wasn't. It really kind of wasn't. I don't even think it says you can make threats. It's kind of a legislative issue. But when they're saying when someone is not making an actual threat, threats can be expressed. When somebody commits a copyright violation or potentially commits a copyright violation, their identity can be exposed. If somebody's a witness to a crime and they need to issue a subpoena, might be able to disclose their identity. And it's also under these circumstances and very important that disclosing the actual identity, if they say not only must the person who or the entity that wants the identity exposed say that it's necessary for these purposes, but disclosure is necessary. I think this is a very important disclosure of the person's identity is necessary. I think this is very important to understand that this First Amendment protection of anonymous speech does have limits because while it's not necessarily to know all the limits in order to have the debate, you have to know that there are limits. This is important for the pro because I think the pro wants to say, yes, the First Amendment protection of anonymous speech should generally exist, but it is subject to limits as interpreted by the courts in the status quo, in the present world that we live in. It shouldn't be completely unlimited, and there's nothing in the resolution to suggest that the affirmative should have to say it's completely unlimited. In fact, the way the courts have interpreted it now suggests that it is not completely unlimited. Now let's look at some of the terms in the resolution. Unlike some other resolutions, I think the terms in this resolution are pretty straightforward. First of all, protection is the act of protecting someone or something or the state of being protected. What's important here to point out is that this is a legal protection, right? The First Amendment legal protection. It's not any type of physical protection. And as I just explained, I think it's talking about the current level of First Amendment protection. Harms are simply the negative impact or consequences that occur as a result of the anonymous speech. Outweigh simply means to be greater than or more significant than. There's a couple things to point out here. One, just generally, you're saying the First Amendment protection outweighs the harms. You don't have to win on the pro that there are no harms at all associated with anonymous speech. Just that the First Amendment protection outweighs that. And there's a couple things to point out here. That the benefits are legal. They're legal or philosophical. We're talking about values, freedom of expression, the idea that you should be able to express yourself privately, the importance of privacy. These are all legal or philosophical values that are important, but don't necessarily have as much consequential impacts. They're more theoretical, whereas the harms are consequential. We're talking about hate speech, violence being maybe potentially directed at people as a result of that. So that's something to think about as you move into your final, you move into your summary speeches and your final focus. You want to make some arguments as to why each one of those may trump the other. And then, of course, the First Amendment, which generally concerns free speech. So I don't think that the terms of this resolution are really going to be contested very much by either side. Con teams may try to make an argument that the pro has to argue for kind of an absolute unconditional protection of free speech. But I don't think that there's any kind of reason for that argument to be true. They're just talking about the First Amendment protection of free speech, and I think the pros should say that we should just have to defend it the way it's interpreted in the status quo. I mean, there's certainly no right in the Constitution that's absolute at all. So that kind of put the affirmative in kind of an unwinnable position if they had to defend some absolutist interpretation of free speech in the First Amendment that protects unlimited use of anonymous speech. The most reasonable interpretation is really just to say that they should have to defend the status quo. Now let's look at the pro arguments on the resolution. Basically, there are three key arguments that the pro needs to win the debate. First, they need to win that anonymous speech is intrinsically valuable to free speech. They have to make a specific case for anonymous speech. And then second, they need to win that free speech is also generally valuable. They can't just win the second argument that free speech is generally valuable because there are a lot of other ways that people have the opportunity to speak freely, not just anonymously. So they have to win the anonymous is intrinsic to free speech, or intrinsically valuable to free speech, and intrinsically valuable form of free speech. Then they need to win that free speech is good, and then they need to win that the benefits of that outweigh the harms. And of course, that involves answering the arguments that the con's going to make as to why it's harmful, to at least minimize those. As I said previously, they don't have to defeat them entirely because they just need to win that the benefits outweigh the harms. So let's look at why is anonymity so valuable. What are the arguments the pro needs to make? First, they should argue that it is historically important. I just referenced some examples of founding fathers who used anonymous speech as an important way to contribute to the development of the country and democracy in the United States. Second, you have to argue that people will feel more comfortable to express themselves without job loss or social exclusion. You know, when people make arguments on controversial issues, until those arguments become kind of salient and gain widespread support, people can experience a lot of alienation for even making the arguments in the first place. So it's that's one of the key reasons that anonymous speech is important. Also, that you need to argue that each person decides what speech is valuable, not simply based on the identity of the speaker. You want to argue that speech, when the author doesn't have an identity, it kind of forces people to make even better arguments because you're not relying on the qualifications of that individual to make the argument. The other reason it's important is for equality, because a lot of times in areas of public speech, especially on the internet, if somebody finds out the speaker is a minority or a woman, they'll kind of automatically attack the individual simply just kind of based on their identity rather than the argument that's being made. It also is important to protect journalists against the government trying to oppress speech. You can also argue it's very important to privacy, that people's thoughts and ideas, that there should be a balance. Of course, once you express your thoughts and ideas in public, those become public. But you also maintain privacy yourself through the protection of anonymous speech, and you can talk about why privacy is important. You can also argue in the age of the internet that anonymity is especially important because whatever you say is permanent, and you may change your views later on in life, especially as you grow older, or you may just have different ideas. But those ideas will stay out there forever on the internet. And it's also easier to find. Even if you say something controversial about a local idea in your community, now that it used to be just kind of, for the most part, confined to your community. Of course, somebody could take it and go outside of the community and you said X, Y, or Z, but it'd be very difficult for that to kind of spread around in any significant way. Now, anything you say online about any issue, local, regional, or national, or international, is just going to appear all over the internet. So it's arguably especially important in the area of the internet. So these are some of the key arguments you want to make as to why it is particularly valuable in a valuable form of free speech. Then, of course, you want to answer the con arguments. And I'm going to spend some time here talking about how to answer different con arguments. But before I do that, I want to point out a few general answers you can make to all con arguments to talk about the harms associated with anonymous speech. First, as I've already discussed, there are limits. There are limits. You can't just do and do anything you want anonymously. You can't libel people, unrestrained. You can't threaten to kill people in a literal sense anonymously. So there are limits that have been imposed that have already been discussed, and that kind of generally preempts or addresses a lot of the con arguments. The second argument is that the value of free speech should not be determined by the consequences. As I've already discussed, these are important philosophical and legal principles, and you shouldn't just resolve that based on the consequences of the actions. The third is you want to argue that the anonymous speech inherently pushes more ideas into the marketplace of ideas. Why does it do that? Because it encourages people to contribute, because everything they say won't be pushed back against them. They won't, as I said, face exclusion socially or at their jobs. All right, that women maybe feel more comfortable to participating because they won't be attacked based on their gender. And when you get better ideas out there into the marketplace of ideas, this just kind of intrinsically starts to address some of the harms, some of the social problems that result as a result of the anonymous speech. The more ideas you have out there, the better it is to persuade people, and the better ideas generally rise to the top. That's a core principle behind the protection of free speech and protection of anonymous speech specifically. But now let's look at how to answer some of the main negative arguments. One of the main negative arguments is that anonymous speech is bad because it makes it easier for people to libel others, to say things about them that aren't true, that can damage them economically and socially. Well, first of all, when libel is suspected, it is possible for, under the current First Amendment protection standards, it is possible for this to be disclosed. Second is, again, the value of speech, free speech should not be determined by consequences, and that there are just other ways to protect against libel other than to reveal somebody's identity. They may have libeled somebody in another way in a public arena. There may be other ways for the person to deal with the libel so it doesn't have negative consequences. These can all be addressed. Now, how to answer hate speech arguments. Now, one of the strongest arguments the con can make is that anonymous speech protects hate speech. And hate speech is more than just saying nasty things. Hate speech is speech directed against what you would kind of understand to be a protected group in society that attacks a person, threatens them for being a member of that group. For example, if somebody is gay or a racial minority and you make racial slurs or homophobic comments against those people who are members of the protected group, that is considered hate speech. It's really impossible to kind of refute the link because the courts have said that current First Amendment standards protect hate speech. So when you defend those status quo standards of First Amendment protection, I think on the pro you really have to defend hate speech. I don't think there's any way to get out of the argument. But of course, generally you want to argue that free speech is good. And I think you can argue that hate speech is good. There is actually a good debate, as I said, in the separate body of literature, some of which is for both sides is included in this release, that talks about why hate speech is good. That it acts as a safety valve against violence, that when people speak out in hateful ways, that what they actually do is, then they're less likely to commit violence against other groups. It does kind of reaffirm the idea that all speech and all people are equal no matter what somebody says or does. We're not making any value judgments about particular forms of speech one way or the other. So you can make arguments to defend hate speech. That's why people have. That's why it's protected as part of the First Amendment. It sounds bad, but it's definitely defensible, and you can really make that argument. Strategically, it's something you may even want to put in your first speech if you think, especially if if you're pro and you go first. If you know the con's going to make arguments against hate speech, you could argue that right in your first speech that the First Amendment protects anonymous hate speech, and that hate speech is valuable part of society and should be protected by the First Amendment. You don't want to have to necessarily say that the hate speech itself is valuable, but it is valuable to protect it. Okay, offensive speech. How do we answer that argument? Because anonymous speech, and really any kind of speech, can be really offensive and rude. It doesn't rise legally to the standard of hate speech, but it's still problematic. People can say nasty things about one another online that can hurt people's feelings, be really offensive, be considered bullying. And opponents of anonymous speech argue that anonymous speech makes that more likely. So how do you address that argument? Well, first of all, you can argue that communities can regulate themselves. One example of this is the Yik Yak app, which I referred to later, which Yik Yak is an app that allows people within a certain geographic radius to talk and speak anonymously. It's completely anonymous, but there are issues that have arisen with this anonymous speech in regards to some of the con arguments being made. But one thing that Yik Yak has is like a vote down argument, which is a vote down button, which is essentially the same opposite, I should say, of the Facebook like button, right? So if you push it down and it gets 5 downs, then it basically kind of starts to disappear on the system. So communities can regulate. Site administrators can regulate. They can push hate speech off online and try to get rid of some of the negative or nasty comments that are being made if they wish. The other answer is just that really the reason, we don't really kind of completely ban these forms of speech is there's obviously a gray area as to kind of what constitutes offensive speech and doesn't constitute offensive speech. And the community, the people who participate in that online community should get to decide, not some external regulators. In extreme situation, it's possible that identities can be disclosed. Yik Yak has disclosed identities in the past. Now, this is obviously they're a private company, so they're not really kind of bound. They can provide more protection than the courts have interpreted the First Amendment to provide, for people against free speech issues, right? If they see a lot of threats, it's whatever their user policies are, they can disclose this information. And you can also say government paternalism is bad. It's not really, it should be up to people to kind of decide whether or not they want to participate in these communities, whether or not they want to engage in speech, what types of speech they want to engage in. It shouldn't just be the government saying, hey, this speech is bad, and not allowing it. All right, another kind of core objection to anonymous speech is election fraud. This argument says that if people contribute anonymously regarding election issues, then and make statements regarding election issues, and they do it anonymously, then they really don't have to be held to what they say, and essentially means that false information gets out there in the election cycle, and it contributes to election fraud. In the case of Ohio Election Commission versus McIntyre, this is one of the core objections that the Election Commission made. They said if you allowed this, fraud could be perpetuated. Well, first of all, there's other ways to fight against fraud in elections. You know, people, if you have something that's released anonymously, that can be countered. Other things that are published, have to be published by people all with a name on it. Everything in an election cycle is not going to be held anonymously. There's other ways to kind of fight against fraud. There's obviously other regulations you have on voting and those types of things that can fight against election fraud. The second thing is you want to argue that when more ideas get out there, again, it makes people's kind of votes and the ideas that they develop about the election and the candidates, the more ideas that are out there, the stronger the election is. And then, of course, you just want to make the argument that the value of free speech outweighs any risk, small risk and small harm that could come from election fraud, even if it occurs. That's one of the things the court said, and if you look at that quote from the beginning of the lecture, that's one of the things the court said very explicitly, that the benefit of this free speech here outweighs any risk of any fraud. The next argument that the con will make is that anonymous speech kind of decreases the quality of evidence because you don't really know who the speaker is. There are a number of answers to this argument. The first is that the strength of the argument made online, it's actually good that it's not tied to the author. We shouldn't just say, well, who's the author of this statement and then give it more or less credibility. This way you can kind of just look at people who are reading the forums, in the online forums or apps, and they'll just look at the actual argument itself and see how strong it is. The second argument you want to make is that women and minorities' opinions and evidence and ideas are often excluded when the person has to be identified because people don't give kind of women and minorities as much credibility in these types of forums. The third, again, just make your general marketplace of ideas argument. More ideas, the better. And then also you want to say that people can discern good arguments from bad arguments. That, look, the whole foundation, one of the founding ideas behind the democracy is that people are capable of, are smart, reasonable, and making quality judgments. If people couldn't do this, right, if you do not believe that people were smart enough to come to make reasoned decisions, then democracy in itself is a flawed concept, right? We should just have a king who would make or a queen who would make all the decisions for us. But the whole principle and concept of democracy is based on the idea that people can make their own intelligent decisions and one of those decisions is about the quality of evidence and the quality of arguments. Now let's look at the con. Now you've already have some ideas here about what are the major con arguments because I just discussed about how to answer them. But basically you want to make some main arguments, all right? You want to make some main arguments. First, you want to argue that hate speech is bad, that it encourages violence, and there's a lot of stuff that kind of ties hate speech back to Nazi Germany, and that the rise of Hitler and other kind of in the Nazi Party was all made possible by hate speech, and we should not let this continue. It simply means that history could repeat itself. It encourages violence against minority groups in the United States, such as particular gays. The second is harassment, that women and minorities are likely to be harassed in these online communities and people don't have any restraint on anything they say being kind of traced back to them. You want to argue that the pro-evidence, that all the evidence written by the pro is generally kind of written by white males or biased towards white males. Yes, it's very easy for white males to say we should have unrestrained free speech because they're generally not the target of harassment, at least relative to minorities and women. The fourth argument you want to make, of course, is libel, that people can be liable. They can say terrible, false things about other people that hurt them, especially hurt them economically, and there's no way to trace it back. You also want to say that it undermines democracy because bad information gets out there and it undermines people's ability to make quality decisions in democratic democratic organizations, democratic countries. Now, how do we answer some of the key pro arguments on the con? We went through the pro lecture. We talked about how to answer the con arguments. Now we're talking about the con side and how are we going to answer the pro arguments. Well, first of all, let's talk about history. Remember, one of the key pro arguments was that historically we've protected anonymous speech. There's a couple answers to this argument. First of all, history doesn't make it a right. Just because we've had a historical practice doesn't mean it's a good practice or that it's protected by the Constitution, right? I mean, slavery occurred in history. It doesn't make it a good idea. We've had prohibition in the past and we decided to get rid of it. We have a lot of changes in history. Now we're introducing modern technologies, things like, online forums and apps like Yik Yak that didn't exist 200 years ago. So it's really not possible. It's really just because we've had this in history, and maybe even if it was a good idea at the time, does not mean it's a good idea at the present. And I think this is especially a good time for the con to bring in a lot of kind of current concrete examples, specifically revolving around Yik Yak and a lot of the harm that's been caused, and there's a kind of an evidence update on the site about that. You also want to say it's not a historical right in terms of elections or in terms of specific things. And we're talking about publishing in the past really kind of anonymous pamphlets and anonymous materials about the founding of the government. There's no it doesn't necessarily mean that people should be able to do this in the context of elections or in the context of online forums. Just because anonymous speech has occurred in the past in one area doesn't mean there's a right to it, especially a right to it to occur in all other areas in the present. All right, how can we answer this kind of discussion quality marketplace of ideas argument that the pro is going to rely on? First of all, you want to argue that anonymity increases harassment and actually excludes people from the marketplace of ideas, right? It may make it more likely that some people will post anonymously, but it's also the flip side can be true, that a lot of people are likely to leave the discussion because they feel harassed. The second of all, the empirical evidence on this is really just not one way. There's a good piece of evidence in the file that I turned out that says sometimes it increases the quality of discussion and then other times it does not. You also want to argue that there's no inherent benefit to more voices. Just because you have more people quote-unquote yik-yakking does not mean you're going to have a better discussion, all right, or better ideas are going to get exposed. And that actually, if you require people to disclose their identity, the quality of the comments in these discussion forums tends to actually increase. There's actually some evidence to support this, and there's probably even some anecdotal evidence. If you just kind of look online, you can kind of see different kind of discussions occurring between message boards where people can post anonymously and message boards where they have to kind of identify themselves or they use the Facebook commenting system and where most people kind of have their own identities. All right, how do we answer free speech? How do we answer the general claim that we need to protect free speech? First of all, again, you want to argue that free speech is not an absolute right. No right in the Constitution is absolute. So no matter what right we're looking at, we're talking about imposing conditions and limits on it. And the question is just where to have those conditions and limits. And you want to say that it should not protect anonymous speech, right? And you can even say that anonymous speech is not an absolute right. Even if free speech is, or maybe not an absolute right, but a very important right, it's not necessarily the case of why anonymous speech is so critical. People can contribute, first of all, to the democracy. They can go out and they can form political opinions. They can express them online. They can express them in newspapers. They can publish pamphlets. They can get on TV and they can give speeches. They can participate in debates. They can call their candidates in office. These are all different ways that people can participate using free speech, just not anonymous speech. Also, it's really just the United States that really has such kind of an extreme interpretation of free speech that really kind of pushes to the point where it's, almost unlimited, maybe 80% unlimited, right, with very few constraints. But there are many other democracies in the world, and those countries do not have kind of such extreme interpretations of what's protected by free speech, yet they remain democracies. Fourth, you want to argue that online forums are run by private companies. These do not constitute the public sphere, right? If the other side, if the pro is really giving examples about the importance of anonymous speech in online forums, say, look, this isn't the public sphere. This is just something that's run by a company. How do we answer the privacy argument? All right, first of all, you want to say privacy is not absolute. Again, no right is absolute. Privacy is not even explicitly identified anywhere in the Constitution. And of course, as we know from things like the Patriot Act and everything that's going on with surveillance, we have different forms of drone surveillance. We have informants in communities. We have the FBI flying airplanes over our cities. There's so many other ways that privacy is impacted. There's no really way that impacted and undermined. There's no really way you can argue that anonymous speech is intrinsic to privacy or very important part of privacy, and that privacy can't be protected in other ways. Privacy really, in my mind, is at best a secondary concern. So I hope you found this lecture useful. I did just review some of the basic background of the dispute and some of the key arguments on each side, as well as the terminology. I think this is an excellent topic, and more importantly, an excellent resolution. Sometimes we have great topics, we don't have great resolutions. But this resolution is very well worded, and it gets at the key issues on both sides of the topic. So you want to be prepared with these arguments and how to answer them on each side. As I kind of alluded to earlier, as you're moving into your final focus and your final focus, your summary speeches, you want to start to set up some ways for the judges to compare which one of these is more important than the other. Because unless the other team makes a mistake and drops some very important arguments, which are probably not likely to do, because we really have the better teams debating at nationals, you have to really kind of focus on whoever wins these debates is going to win. Because, on the con, they're going to say the consequential arguments are more important, and on the pro, they're going to say these values like free speech and the philosophical concepts behind free speech and privacy trump these consequentialist impacts. So I think you really want to kind of start setting up those arguments and start thinking